Good morning, good afternoon, and possibly good evening. This is Alvin Taveras, your host here at the Build to Rent Network. We're here for our episode 3, where we're joined by Jasmine Williams and Tim Casey. And Tim, you have a very unique article to get us going. You're talking about the Fed and that they're possibly not overheating anymore. Can you walk us through more details?
Yeah, thanks, Alvin. I think everyone who works with me knows I love talking economics, and when our old faithful Fed Chair Jerome Powell jumps into the Senate Banking Committee and has conversations, I'm all ears. He indicated that the case for interest rate cuts later in the year, it's developing, but he needs more evidence before they really talk about inflation substantially decreasing. So, a lot of good conversations. I think a lot of trends are moving in the right direction from a Fed perspective. But, he also made a point to call out housing. And this has kind of been a sore spot for me because, when he talks about housing, I always feel like he takes the approach of he wants to punt the ball, right? That's not a Fed problem. I can't impact that, and his quote where he specifically called out, we don't have enough housing. He acknowledged it. And then he followed that with, and that's not really a monetary policy issue. Kind of set me off a little bit. I kind of blew up a couple different avenues of social media talking about how that is very much not the case. And this perspective of, no, the Fed isn't swinging hammers. The Fed is not building homes, but their influence on monetary policy, specifically interest rates, plays a huge role in the housing market. And, how housing markets are so dynamic, and zoning laws, construction costs, supply chain disruption, labor costs, all of these pieces are impacted by Fed policy. And, my concern is when he makes a statement like, that's not really a monetary policy issue, that's fine, that's his right. But it also shows that maybe housing isn't as much in his decision matrix as it needs to be as, the Fed forms these economic policies. So for me, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, from a monetary policy, investment decisions, are a big part of our business, right? Like we're working with investors, helping shepherd them through that investment decision. And we all need to be mindful of, that changing strategy or shifts within the Fed as we continue to invest and guide our investors. So I think it's important whenever, the Fed chair speaks, maybe he's saying, it's not really a monetary policy issue, but investors still need to listen. Like they still need to very much be listening to what he's saying and understanding his perspective. And I think, unfortunately, right now, his perspective is not my problem. It is a problem, but not my problem. And I think that was the takeaway for me this week.
It's funny because when they talk about inflation, so there's two parts there. One is that the one of the largest expenses we all have is housing. Right. So if you're talking about the cost of living as an American, right, you're saying housing is the biggest lion's share. Second is taxes, right? So, yep. I mean, those are, and then you look at the source of inflation, and then you would say, well, that's government spending. And so these subject matters aren't discussed in that format, and they should be, right? So the Fed should be, when they're talking to congressmen and senators, to say, hey, you guys could help me out a lot with regards to reducing inflation if you just stop spending as much money. If we stopped printing money, each of our dollars would hold their value more. But because we keep printing, right, that's the source of inflation. I think Milton Friedman was the one saying that's the only source of inflation.
He's not wrong.
So it's always funny when they think of it from that perspective. And again, when you look at housing, okay, so housing is more unaffordable in large part because of the cost of financing. So has prices gone up? Yes, they gone up, but the lion's share of that increase for the monthly payment is now paid in interest payments. And that's not the value of a home going up, even if you're paying more, at least you're paying down your debt. When it's servicing an interest rate, that only goes to the bank. There's no benefit for the homeowner. So that's another major point. And again, it slows down construction. So developers are going to have less liquidity, less access to capital. They're going to be scrutinized more for that capital, and that gamble that they're taking is bigger, right? They're taking a bigger risk, which automatically means that less people are going to take on that endeavor of building something brand new.
Right.
And so, one of the things that's interesting about his statements is the market reaction, and it actually is people are moving up their forecast because of his statements on when interest rates will go down. I've always said I think next year, February, just because I didn't feel like he wanted to affect the presidential race, and the data always lags a little bit. But
It
now
does.
70% of economists believe we will get a rate cut in September. So to me, that's the biggest takeaway. That's not my belief. I'm in that 30% thinks it will be later, but the ball is moving forward.
And one thing I think about too is, and we, in our industry, we're always someone realizes we're in the real estate investment space, and you kind of get the same series of questions, and oftentimes I encounter individuals saying, "Hey, I want to wait for rates to drop before I start investing in real estate," and I think it is that question that I always counter with of, okay, when interest rates drop, for a mortgage, what do you think is going to happen to home prices, right? Like, do you think home prices are just going to stick where they are? Like, oh, great, interest rates are dropping and this home is priced in the same. I think you always, or historically, you see that inverse reaction, right? So, interest rates drop, home prices elevate at an increasing pace. Interest rates increase, it's, home price growth stabilizes a little bit. But this, I encounter it a lot in my conversations where the general public's expectation is, oh, I can't wait for interest rates to drop because, that's when I want to buy the home. And it's like, well, what do you think is going to happen to home prices at that point?
Yeah, and the two big myths from that end is, one, what was your goal, right? What was your goal to perfectly time one purchase,
Good luck.
right? Probably not. Most investors, you talk to them, their goal is to acquire 20 properties in the next 5 years. So if you delay a year, now you have to, do 20 properties in 4 years.
Right.
now, so now that obstacle becomes harder. And the other thing is that if you are a long-term investor, you're basically saying that I understand that in the long run, things are going to work out for me. Right? I believe in big picture, things will generally work out. So why are we so fixated on 1 year? Because whether it happens, so there is always a difficult time in the horizon. There's no way to avoid that. If you're a long-term investor, you're going to encounter some challenges. But whether it's right now or 3 years from now, either way, you have to be prepared for that moment. And so, but what you can't do is sit on your hands for years because you're not an investor at that point.
Right. Yeah.
And that's supposedly was your goal.
I'm going to have to agree with you guys a lot of what you're saying. And it's funny because these are conversations that I'm actually starting to have more and more often with investors. I think, honestly, I started proactively having these conversations a couple years ago. I think we probably all did, kind of foreseeing what was coming, because what happens a lot of times I see as investors are a lot of time, I would say people in the real estate market in general are a lot of time behind the curve. So that person that's saying, oh, I'm going to wait until, the interest rate drops. Not only are we looking at to see what's going to happen with the prices, but you and, 50,000 other people. So good luck actually being able to get that property, again. I always say that the best time to buy is when the numbers make sense and when you can afford it. I mean, that's really just the reality of it, and what you guys were saying about how, and I think anybody, just understanding how what the Fed is doing affects the housing market in general, not just buyers. As you mentioned, Alvin, it's the cost of money for developers. We have a housing shortage, yet we're making it more expensive to be able to provide housing. So good luck with relieving that housing shortage. So there's a lot of questions that are coming up from a lot of people trying to time the market or understand what is happening. But the reality of it is when the numbers make sense, the numbers make sense. And in order for you to get to whatever your goal is, you just have to move. So hopefully I think like the rest of us, we're hoping to see, some financial policy that actually coincides with what needs to happen to provide some financial relief for this country in general. I mean, to leave the housing market out of the overall financial picture when it's such a heavy indicator just doesn't make sense. Until people can afford to live, not just investors, can afford to be able to live somewhere comfortably. Good luck trying to, stimulate the economy in any other way. So
Right.
those are my thoughts about
And
it.
there are a lot of people who want to end the Fed, and part of their argument for wanting to end the Fed is that you and I are working with investors who have to make decisions, and the Fed is actively making their job more complicated, right? Because they have to anticipate some of these changes that occur. They have to figure out the timing of it, and now it's not just looking at the economic data. They got to now become fortune tellers and figure out what the Fed's going to do and how that's going to impact them. So the Fed is actively becoming their own factor. And I mean, it's been like, almost 2 years now that we keep talking about interest rates all the time. That's not good for a business owner to make decisions based on. They should be looking at other data points. But instead, because of these changes, and again, the difference between a 3% interest rate and a 7 or 8% interest rate is massive. It is a big difference. Now, obviously, there's ways to still operate in that environment. But when the government itself is almost becoming an obstacle that you have to predict and navigate, that's not a sign of a functioning economy. So I think most of us would just want to say, hey, pick your number and stick to it. And then that's it. Like, let the policyholders make their changes on that end. But again, it has too big of an impact. Quite the opposite of what he's saying. You're actually playing an oversized role in the housing economy than you should.
And I think that's
Yeah.
just in general, when you're looking at how things work with our financial policies, it's always trying to be the fortune teller to superficially, create this type of stimulus that's going to create this, when everything in nature and every facet of life tells us that we should flow with the way that things naturally flow. We should look at consumer behavior. We should look at how these factors that are so like intertwined would naturally play out, and then create policies or create strategies in order to maybe streamline them. But trying to implement strategies or policies in order to try to superficially create, this sort of economic kind of response, it never works out, and so I think that this is we're hearing all of these, the feedback or the comments, the predictions from all of our economists that are saying, oh, we think, they thought or we thought the rate cut was coming a long time ago, now we're pushing it out and trying to play this pinball game, so it just becomes a little bit difficult. And the reality of it is as real estate investors, we can't, make our decisions based on what the Fed is doing.
Yeah. And I think when we look at, and we probably all agree here, but feel free to disagree. I think our strongest investors, right, our most successful investors that we work with, understand shifts in policy, understand the economic ebbs and flows, both macro and micro, and they develop strategies to win in any environment. I mean, some of the strongest business investors, some of the strongest executives I've worked with over the years, they're confident they're going to win. If the market's up, if the market's down, they know that they're going to win. They might not win as much in some scenarios, but they've built these strategies and approach problems in a way that no matter what's happening, I need to acknowledge what's happening. I need to understand it. And then my strategy shifts to take advantage and lever that specific scenario. So, if housing inventory is tight right now, if interest rates are up, if, whatever the scenario, and I think that's our responsibility at Build to Rent as well, right? It's to create investment opportunities that are resilient through these economic shifts and impacts. I mean, when we think about what we're doing with interest rates and working with the builders that we're working with to specifically support, some interest rate buy downs and, years of property management that are covered and all of these different strategies, we're doing the same thing on our end to help those savvy investors win in these changing economic environments.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and that's worth saying as well, is that when we understand what the rest of the industry is having to deal with, And
Right.
then from our end, we're always trying to figure out how do we work with our investors to find a solution for these challenges. So
Yeah.
it's worth saying that we're actually benefiting from the challenges of the housing market because we provide a solution, and that includes the rate buy downs for our more retail investors. And we're doing, interest only bridge loans for a lot of our developers as well, which
Yeah.
is, basically giving them a huge, up to 3 years of just pure cash flow. And then we can time when we bring on the long-term debt to, when interest rates are more affordable. So we're actually working with our partners to solve for these things. And so for us, if we're being selfish, we're saying, hey, keep the chaos going over there because we have the solutions and we're solving for these problems. Uh, I do want to bring up Jasmine's article. Jasmine, you work with a lot of different types of investors, people who do rehabs, do flips, long-term home investors, and there's we have almost like a pent-up demand of people looking to list and they don't know the right timing of it. And so you have an article talking specifically about when you should sell your properties. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times the conversations that I'm having with real estate and with you guys, with investors, come from conversations I'm actively having and working in this market. And so, as you had mentioned, I've been in the real estate industry since 2010, technically, first as a marketing professional and then transitioning into residential sales in 2016, specifically focusing on working on with investors in investment real estate in different facets in the last number of years. And these are conversations that I actually start having with investors about 2 years ago. Like we all are very plugged into all the different economies, for a lack of better words, all the different facets and sectors that tie to what we do as real estate sales professionals, for, just kind of summing up. Um, and these were things that a lot of people and a lot of sectors saw coming. And so having these conversations and saying, hey, it's time to start pivoting. But now, everybody is really feeling the depths of what's going on. They're coming back and saying, hey, Jasmine, what were you saying about, a couple years ago about making a pivot? And now a lot of people are ready to pivot. So this question is a question that I'm actually getting very often. And so I brought it because I wanted to talk about it. I'm having conversations with some of my, some short-term investors who were specializing in working with flips. As we know, COVID market, as I call it, was a perfect time for that. If you had a property or you could get a property at a good price, fix it up, sell it, on the market in 5 days with 30 offers, $50,000 above asking price, which is those lower interest rates, that we were talking about. But it's not that market anymore. And so when we're having those conversations about, okay, how do I pivot to continue investing? When you get to a point where you've been doing a certain strategy for such a long time, and you can't do that anymore, and this is the way that you had anticipated on building your real estate portfolio, you have to know when it's time to pivot. And so some of my either the flippers or maybe the long term, some of the investors that were playing the long term game are realizing that when they're looking at their numbers, they're not really seeing the profitability that they thought they were going to see. And so the conversation is saying, okay, I want to talk to you about some of some of the inventory or some of the strategies that build to rent is using in order to be able to make their investors profitable, in order to, why are investors purchasing 3 or 4 or 5 properties, a year at a time? It's because the numbers make sense. And so this article specifically says, what are some indicators? When is it time to start looking at, maybe it's time for me to liquidate what I have and to move in something better? And that's really the summary of what it is. So it talks about a couple of key indicators to look at. One of them is the cash flow. One of the things that I found, especially with newer investors, but something that I'm surprised by is even with more experienced investors. Actually, you and I, Alvin, talked to someone who had mentioned to us, they brag, oh, I've been investing for 20 years, Well, when it's time to have those conversations about looking at something different, you start to realize, okay, well, I've been doing this for 20 years and it hasn't been working for 20 years. And that's why I'm having the conversation about doing something different. What do those numbers actually look like? You purchased that property for $50,000. You put $100,000 into it. You rented it out for, $800. You had $100 cash flow for 5 years, or 6 years, and then you had to replace the roof, or you had to replace the AC. Well, now you're in the red. And so actually looking at the overall indicators, looking at what you're actually benefiting, what the benefit actually is, that you're gaining from having that property is really important. And I find that a lot of investors don't actually look at those things. So when we're just talking about financial indicators, the two things that this article specifically mentions is actually looking at the actual cash flow, what you're actually retaining in regards to your actual profits, as opposed to what you're actually putting out. So that's not just your mortgage. It's not just your insurance. It's not just, your property management, but also when those big repairs and things come, what did you actually profit in that time frame? One of the things that I love about the build to rent model and how things are structured is the fact that our investors are getting the properties in the most financially beneficial and useful lives of the property. So if you're purchasing a property as soon as it's constructed, the likelihood of you having to replace an AC, or a roof, or, something that's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars and really eat away at all of the profit that you would have made in that time frame it's really none. It's not there. And so by the time you do get to the point where it is time for those costly, repairs, you can look at selling. You can look at other ways that you may be able to tap into the equity that you have in order to reinvest into something else. And one of those other indicators that the article specifically talks about is what we were just talking about, which are the shifting market conditions. If it looks like it's a time where you're going to profit, a great deal, and it's time to roll those funds into something else that may be more profitable, it's time to sell. Holding on to the property just for the sake of saying that I have a rental property is not a good idea. And this article actually talks about something which I actually giggled at when I saw it. It says to consider the sentimental value of the property. And I'm going to tell you to do the exact opposite of that. There is no sentimental value. I actually met with an investor yesterday who was introducing me to their family member. We've been investing for a number of years. They flipped properties, they bought properties. And it's funny because they said to me yesterday, hey, Jasmine, I want to talk to you about my long-term goal. I'm looking to do something different, which I know meant, okay, I've been listening to what you're saying about this build to rent thing. I'm tired of coming out here looking at these $50,000 properties, that are going to make me 20 grand after I look at my holding costs, my insurance, what I had to pay for closing costs, having to get that tenant out, my vacancy loss, all of those things. And I'm ready to do something that's actually going to be beneficial long term. And the family member looked at me and said, what do you think about the property? And I said, I don't think anything about the property. I think we need to run the numbers. And at the end of the day, when you look at that is the biggest mistake that I think a lot of people make. They come into real estate investing and say, oh, I have this goal. I want to own 20 properties. I want to have, buy a property a year or 5 properties a year for the next 5 years. And not once did they ever actually sit down and look at the financial indicators, their return on their investment, their cash on cash return, their net operating expense, all of these things. They don't really know whether or not they're making money, And so I would say that in summary, what this article really says is that the time to sell your rental property or your investment property is when it's time to make more money, And if you're looking at your real estate portfolio, like a lot of investors that I'm talking to are, and they're looking at the strategies that they've been using for the last number of years, after they pay their capital gains tax, after they pay the, on the actual income that they've, reported from their flips, after they've calculated all the expenses, and all the money that they've spent, all the money that they've lost from not having tenants and having to replace things. Am I really making the money that I thought I was going to make? And a lot of times that answer is no, And so this article really gives just very simple points to say, it's time for you to know when it's time to roll over and actually make some profitable real estate investments, which is exactly what we're doing here at Build to Rent.
Yeah, and I think Jasmine, I appreciate this article so much because this is really talking a lot about what we talk about every day, right? It is, if you're going to invest in real estate, do you want to be in the driver's seat or do you want to be in the passenger seat, right? And so much of this is about strategy. How many investors that I've talked to on the short-term rental side and the long-term rental side of, Tim, I'm struggling. I don't think I'm making much money. Okay, well, let's look at your business model. Let's look at your pro forma. How did you enter into this endeavor? And then how are you tracking your performance now? And far too often the response is, I didn't have a pro forma. I didn't put together a business model. I just know that a lot more money is going out than coming in. That's all I know. And that's not setting yourself up for success. Now, does that mean all you need to do is set a strategy and you're going to win? Absolutely not. I mean, the most overused quote in business school and business right now is everyone has a play until they get punched in the face, right? And so, it is that approach of like, you need to understand what your forecasted cash flow is when you go into a business endeavor, especially real estate investment, but just business in general. So you can't be caught off guard if you have a loss of positive cash flow. You shouldn't be caught off guard if you have costly repairs. You should have a plan for all of these variables that can impact your ability to be successful in the market. And then any sound business strategy also includes an exit strategy, right? And that exit strategy has to be about, I'm not going to hit a bullseye. I'm not going to say at 9 years, 32 weeks, 4 days, and 2 hours, I'm going to sell this property. It's going to be like, my vision is I'm going to buy this new build. I'm going to hold it for 10 years. 5 years in, I'm going to cash out refi to expand my holdings. At 10 years, I'm going to sell. Okay, that 10 years can be a plus or minus 3 years, depending on how you're looking at it. But you have to go at it from that clear vision of, here's how I'm going to approach it. Because all of these, when might be the right time, to sell your rental property, you don't want these to be like, oh gosh, I have to sell this quick. No, I'm in control. I've put this strategy in place. I know generally where I'm moving. I'm not going to be caught off guard by, a shifting market condition because I've kind of prepared for shifting market conditions. I didn't overbake my pro forma to make it seem like I'm going to have like top 1 percentile performance. I gave myself some flexibility, and I was, hard on the numbers to make sure that I really stress test this business model. And so market fluctuations, I've protected myself against those things. And, understanding that growing your investment, especially with the build to rent model, but in a lot of real estate investment models, that initial investment kind of kickstarts your growth if you play the smart game, right? I mean, we talk about this often of like, if at 5 years you have the opportunity to cash out refi, you're able to cash out refi and expand your portfolio, but you're doing that with the equity. I mean, so you can build a whole portfolio from the initial down payment of your first property if you build that strategy correctly. And that's really how you're in the driver's seat versus, oh, someone told me to buy an investment property. I bought an investment property. Let me jump in the passenger seat right here and figure out what's going to happen. Oh crap, the car broke down and I don't know what to do. And that's that difference of perspective, difference of approach, and that strategic mindset that working with, professional Jasmine like yourself, you're going to help that client, you're going to help that investor get that confidence and that competence to be able to move forward intelligently in the driver's seat of their investment.
Well said. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's so interesting that you say that because I literally just talked about this yesterday. I had a conversation with someone who's actually a legal professional, and they work with developers and CDs and things like that over in Jacksonville. And they were talking about their introduction into real estate being from someone else. And I said, oh, that's awesome. So what kind of profit are they making? What's been their return? And they're like, they have no idea. I can remember having a conversation with an investor of mine who had a pretty wide real estate portfolio, and at a point they were moving into bigger deals. They were moving into some commercial things, and they were going to sell their short-term rental business. Okay, well, send me your financials, right? What I got was a spreadsheet with some information on it. And I had to call them back and say, hey, I know you got this, this $6,000 booking recently and this $3,000 booking recently, but you were in the red. All
Right.
the two of these properties are operating in the red, and only one of these properties were keeping it afloat. And then that one had the major repair. And so now this short-term rental business is not profitable,
Right.
And it's not just that. I mean, we've had a conversation, Alvin and I, with an investor who had boasted of being a 20-year real estate investor. And Alvin said, okay, well, are you doing a 1031 exchange? Or you're rolling your
Yeah.
profits into something else. And they had never done that. Can you imagine, 20 years of real estate investing, flipping, selling, flipping, selling, flipping, selling, and you're being taxed on all of that
Right.
income. It's mind blowing to me. But that is why I love the approach that we have. And I actually had a conversation, someone had scheduled an investor consultation with me. And I literally said to them, I could have sold you 10 properties right now if I really wanted to. I can tell you what it is that you want to hear, tell you where to put your money and go from there. But the reality of it is it's your responsibility to do the studying. I'm providing
Yeah.
you the information. I'm telling you the things that are going to help, but I'll also tell you when something just is not a good deal. And this deal that we're looking at is not a good deal,
Right.
And so I'm going to send you some things that can actually help you be profitable. And it's actually, I chuckled a little bit and I told them about it because they said, well, my so-and-so told me to use the 70% rule. And I said, oh, I love talking about that stuff. We just talked about the 70% rule. And it's something that not only a lot of newer investors, but there are a lot of investors who have been investing for years, 5, 10, 15 years, and have never used any other strategy other than just that, that rule. They don't know whether or not in the long run they've actually been profitable. And then at the end of the day, they're just going, it's time for me to sell these properties. I don't know why, but I
Right.
know that I don't have the money that I'm supposed to have. And so it's time to sell. And that's not the situation that we want to be in. So I love the fact that with Build to Rent, we are real estate consultants. We have a lot of expertise and a lot of experience across different sectors that are connected to the real estate industry. We work together, we tie that information together, we educate each other so that when we're having conversations with an investors, we're actually saying, this is a plan. I'm not here to sell you a property. I'm here to educate you on a plan that's going to help you accomplish your goal, and that comes from these financial documents that we have. It comes from the pro forma. It comes from the rental values that we're providing based on the property management companies that we're already using. It comes from the appraised value that we've already are aware of and we're sure of because we just appraised the property next door, and we know that you're going into this duplex with $25,000 in equity and you're going to have a tenant pay your mortgage and cash flow 125 or whatever. It's very specific, and I love the fact that Alvin and the team goes back as we close deal and make sure that those numbers, like you said, Tim, they are scrutinized to make
Right.
sure that they're as accurate as they can be so that we can continue to invest with our investors and to continue to advise them years into the future and not have them say, I want to sell my property because I'm not making any money, but more so, I want to sell this property because I'm coming up on my 10-year mark and I want to buy a couple more quadplexes or whatever that response is. So I love what we do here at Build to Rent with really taking not just a consultative approach, but also an educational one to be able to help not just new investors, but experienced investors as well.
So Jasmine, you mentioned the 1% rule, the 70% rule. Alvin, we spoke about it on Monday as a group. This kind of fires me up a little bit, right? Because these rules, these rules were established. These rules were put in place when you had investors who were trying to analyze 100, 200, opportunities at once. So they need a quick rule, a general rule to narrow it down. And then what happens is you get all of these social media gurus who, they own 100 billion doors, and they're millionaires, yet when they reach out to me to qualify for an investment property, they don't have any money. But they've got all of these rules, right? Let's just follow the 1% rule, you'll be a millionaire in no time. These rules are devised by, they originate with larger institutions that are trying to sift through global inventories. And then from there, they use that to narrow down, and then they do their extreme due diligence. I tell investors all the time, forget the rule. Dig into the pro formas. We've done so much of the work on the build to rent front to filter these properties down, right? We've done 95% of the work. Now we're connecting that investor and teaching and aligning with that investor so they can do the last 5%, right? They can get the deal across the finish line. But these rules are so funny to me because these rules are not for that first time investor, yet they act like, oh, I went on X and I read about the 1% rule, so now I'm an investing expert. And this deal, let me tell them about this 1% rule and how I use it, it's so fascinating, and it's so important that, like, okay, the rule is there. It's not really for you. Dig into the pro forma. Learn to read a P&L, for crying out loud. It's not hard. It's a basic checking and expense structure, right? It's revenue, it's expenses. Learn to read it. And then if you learn to read that and you work with a professional, you're going to find the right deal that checks your boxes without having some imaginary, 70%, 1%, 3%, 4%. It doesn't matter. Work on the P&L, run through the pro forma, and you will find success in real estate investing.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're talking about is strategy versus effort, right? And so do we spend time analyzing our strategy? Do we spend time using the right amount of effort? So I grew up in a more immigrant family, and we thought, hey, you just put more effort and you get better results. That's what we thought. That's how we, right? You do the painting yourself, you'll save some money, and the tenants won't realize. Turns out they can realize. Everyone can spot a spotty paint job. It's pretty easy to find. And if you just paint everything white, everything gets solved, including the outlets and kitchen counters and everything. So
don't forget the window seals.
No.
And all of your surroundings.
Of course. So when a lot of us think of real estate investing, a lot of us think of it as almost like you're building a company. One of the hard things for a lot of people to do is that it's hard work. It can be defeating a lot of times when you start thinking about you having to be the thing that makes it go. And so a lot of people, and this is what Gito was talking about, they put all this effort in expecting a certain outcome, and when they don't get that outcome, or they're still having to be the pinwheel that holds everything together, is they get defeated, they get deflated as a result of it. And then you have conversations like this where you realize, well, I did all this work, did all this stuff, and this includes, whether it's development, whether it's rehabbing, whether it's short-term rentals, and then you're like, hey, what was the payoff? And then when you finally go to analyze what your hard work was after paying taxes, after all that stuff, you're like, I don't know if that was worth it. So,
not to mention it took 2 years to do, Alvin.
Right, and so you're just like saying, hey, that was a heavy stress load I took on, heavy risk, and now even with the market, none of us can anticipate, an exorbitant amount of rental increases or exorbitant amount of appreciation at this point. So now that you can't even factor that in or be optimistic that that's going to save you, it's like, what are you stuck with? And so a lot of times when we meet with investors, we're figuring out, hey, real estate can be passive, but done well, it has to be passive enough. So not 100% passive. You can't just put money on it and leave it alone. But you got to have a strategy. A lot of times the part that we say, hey, the work is on the education. And you should plan to, if you decide to be a real estate investor, to say, hey, I'm going to start, but my goal is to have continuous learning, continuous education. I want to get better at tax strategies. I want to get better at taking advantage of debt. I want to be able to get a little bit more creative and time things out. But a lot of it's strategy. And so if you ask me, hey, when's the right time to sell? Well, if it's one of our properties, probably at year 10, right? You would just say, hey, cash out refi year 5, all right, take equity out, go buy a property twice the size, and then go ahead and then at 10 years, that's when things are going to start being due. maybe that's a good time to sell. 1031 to something 4 times bigger, right? So buy a single family in 10 years, 1031 into a quadplex. But that's a formula. I can kind of write that down and know, pencil out. And I know if I buy a property a year and keep doing that, I'll have enough balls in the air and I'll have enough progress momentum that's pretty easy to do. The challenge is when you're put all this work in and you're expecting an outcome, and it's like that's when you get stuck. So I look at build to rent property as being passive enough. The part that does require work is more the strategy and you continuously improving your investing strategies.
And you know what's interesting about that? This same conversation I had, I've spoken with a number of newer investors recently, and the simplest advice I could give them, I'm like, from working with the wholesalers and the flippers and, whoever it is in the real estate investing space, the best advice I can give you is to keep it boring. This is the pro forma. Look at those numbers. Understand what these key indicators mean. And if they make sense and you can afford it, it's the deal. And we're talking about being able to look at, we provide a lot of information. So whether it's someone who's been investing for 40 years or someone who's just been, thought about it 4 minutes ago, it can make sense, right? But the reality of it is if you go into it with the right terms and you can afford to hold on to it, it's going to be profitable. It doesn't have to be that exhausting. It doesn't have to be that scary, because with our inventory, we've gotten rid of, or we've solved a lot of those problems. Actually, when I was having the conversation with, someone like, how do you go from being a national, real estate host to now being a district manager at a company in Central Florida? And I said, well, it's because of the fact that I've been working with investors for the last number of years. And when I talked to the founder at Build to Rent, I realized that Build to Rent solved a lot of the issues that my investors were having. Slowly but surely, all of them would have the same problems. And Build to Rent, our model, our process, solves those problems, because the reality is if you can purchase a property going into it at year one, and you can hold onto it until year 10, you're more than likely going to be profitable. If you are owning a brand new property, what is the likelihood of that property that you purchased in 1950 actually retaining its value in 2020 and 2034, and also you not having to spend all of the money that you gain from rental income on expenses? Good luck rewiring that property. That's going to cost you 20 grand. Good luck with that roof. That's another 15. Good luck with that water heater. That's 1,200. Your appliances, that's another 6,000. There is no money left there. But when you are purchasing a brand new property, those costly expenses are not there. So whether you hold on to it for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or 100 years, and pass it on to whoever. Now, I don't necessarily recommend it. Once you start getting to where now that property is maybe the one that's going to start being due, like Alvin calls it, being due, it's time to pay up on those things. Maybe it's time to sell it. But even if you did, you would still be profitable, right? Because the last time I checked, there isn't a time period that I can look back at in history and say, you know what, this house actually was worth less, in 1945 than it was in 2024. It just doesn't happen. As long as you can withstand those cycles, those ebbs and flows, because the real estate is an up and down market. It happens. A lot of people who talk about losing money in real estate, what it really means that is, I couldn't afford to hold on through that cycle. I couldn't afford to hold on to that property during that downturn. And so I had to get rid of it in order to not continue to drown. But when you go into it with equity, you're collecting you have 3 months guaranteed rent, for God's sakes. I mean, you're going to have zero vacancy, going into it. You already have equity. It's in a quickly growing and appreciating area. It's going to continue to appreciate, and you don't have any repairs. I mean, there wasn't a single problem that I was having with my investors that wasn't being solved by Build to Rent. And that is why it's so easy to educate anybody who's been doing this for 2 minutes or 20 years. And it really just makes sense for our investors, and they continue to come back and invest with us.
Yeah, I do want to go to the last article we have today. And so it's not a new article, But Biden just gave his big boy conference yesterday, and he mentioned a little bit about rents. So we're not going to comment on his performance, but we do want to talk
Okay, I was
about.
ready to, but okay.
No. We're not going to talk about his performance. I do want to just stick to strictly policy. And so in the speech, he said that he's working on putting a cap to a rental rates increase. And so I immediately I was intrigued. So I searched the universe to figure out what this plan was. I couldn't find anything, right? There wasn't a lot of details. It was just saying, hey, we're going to cap rental increases. And I did find a CNBC article that actually came out a few months ago in April, which I think is what he was referring to. And so I'll detail the article, but I'll tell you my opinion first. Is a lot of times when we listen to politicians, they'll give you the signal of what a certain group wants to hear. They'll give you the signal. They'll give you the illusion that they're taking action, they're doing steps, that they're addressing something like that. And then when you look for the actual, like, hey, all right, let me see the actual bill, you realize, oh, there was never a bill drafted. It was just a statement. When you look at, okay, like what did you sign? What did you put in place? There's nothing there. It's more of a signal. And so I from this comment, I actually then did research to figure out, hey, how are people absorbing what he said about the rental rate? Because I didn't see the actual policy. I just saw people interpreted it. And so what you hear for people who are on that camp, they'll say, well, it's a step in the right direction, right? They'll say, hey, it's moving in the right way, even though no details are there. There's no policy, nothing like that. It's just, hey, it's a step in the right direction. Yeah, rent control would be great. It'd be great to cap this. My rent's gone up X, Y, Z, and this, that. And then you get a lot of people on the other side who immediately say, wait, rent control. And so they're saying, they're calling it a cap, not control. And then when you dive into it and actually find out what he was actually referring to, he's actually talking about a unique, a very small, narrow program that exists in the U.S. government. That it's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. It involves about 2.6 million rental homes, and it's basically grants were given out to certain developers to build certain housing, and they try to attach strings to it. So you're like, okay, that's fair, right? So the government funded something. They want to have certain outcomes. It's fair for them to want to control it a little bit. And then you find out that the cap that they're talking about is a 10% cap on rental rate increase, which is like, all right, like I don't know how many subsidized low income housing are experiencing a 10% rental rate increase. But that has to be a remarkably small number of units that will even impact, because that's not the target that you would even go that high. I mean, we predict 4 to 5%, but that's in high growth, high demand markets, not like low income housing. So you kind of break it down, you dive deeper, and you're like, oh, this was just a sign to say that you said something about housing, that you understand that rents are going up and it's a challenge for a lot of people, and I'm going to signal something to the universe that I'm addressing it. But when you actually dive into it, it's nothing burger. Nothing's really happening here.
Can you imagine if something like that was actually implemented? Because a lot of times what happens is people take those TikTok clips, the news clips, the stories, because that's what happens. Nobody actually watched or read anything. It's like, oh, I'm going to take this clip and put it out there. And a bunch of people go out and vote for rip taps. But the overall thought process, right? Let's just think about the fact that maybe someone in low income, because I think what most people think of as low income is not actually low income. The average person in a 3-bedroom apartment for a family is probably paying $1,200, $1,400, $1,600, $1,800, right? So they're talking about saying that the person who borrowed money in order to provide this low income housing can't raise that person's rent or increase that person's rent in next year by $180. What is the likelihood that someone's out there actually doing that? So I think it's actually funny, that the implications of it, or putting it out there, it's a voter tick word, something to get the voters interested. It's like, oh, I'm going to vote for that rent cap thing, because my rent's really high. But even the thought, I think what it does psychologically, a lot of times those types of games, because that's what they are, they're those types of games that the politicians and their teams play in order to put it out there to try to get those voters. It's the mindset that we in our that live in our markets have about just policy in general, but even specifically the real estate market. Like, think about how like a policy that was actually implemented. Let's talk about I hate to throw it out there, but it's true. The minimum wage increase here in Florida. Throw it out there. Let's get everybody on board. And there's a lot of people on the other side who paid attention, in their economics class in high school and college. It was like, wait, how exactly is this supposed to pan out? Like, this is not going to be good. And I can actually remember having an actual conversation with someone who was like, oh yeah, I voted for so-and-so because I thought this whole minimum wage thing was going to be, a really good thing, but now I regret it. Like, this is an actual conversation that somebody had with me, looking at how overall it affected the cost, of living and how it's spiraled. It's kind of the same thing like we were talking about with the Fed rates, thinking about the rent cap. It's like, and instead of actually making the process of making housing more available, which in turn makes it more affordable, because that's how supply and demand works, let's just implement these superficial caps and raise the Fed and make things more difficult. So we're going to push up this way to make the level of entry or the barriers to entry more difficult. And then we're going to push down this way in order to actually make it less profitable. And let's just see how that pans out. I think we all, know how that's going to pan out. So it's kind of scary, actually, how a lot of times that our politicians in general will play kind of like on the psyche, in a sense, just for the sake of getting voters. Or even if it is something that actually is going to affect our economy, like the Fed rate or minimum wage, like having these types of conversations, generating this type of interest, this emotional feeling in order to get votes that actually really harm our economy. So
yeah, it's that trick of the politician, that awareness of take a very complex issue, a multi-variable issue that is not easily solvable, if solvable at all, and then present it as, this is so easy to solve if only you vote for me. And that's a strategy, because that's what gets the headline, right? So it's that lesson, like Alvin proved right here, is like, if you're gonna spend time reading a headline and actually add that to your thought process, decision matrix, opinion on the matter, you should probably think about doing the work to validate it, because the housing market, it's an ecosystem, it's an organism, it is a complex balance between the home buyer but then also the home builder. You need to create an environment where a builder is incentivized to build. If you create an environment where these are business owners, these are business operators building homes, if it doesn't make any sense for them to build a certain type of home or in a certain area, it's not like out of the kindness of their heart. Capitalism is not built on, I'm going to do business out of the kindness of my heart. It's okay if I don't make any money. It's fine. That model is, it has to be incentivized for the builders to want to build. And I think that's a question here of this headline, Alvin, is, okay, well, how does this deter new construction over time? Does it reduce the overall quality of the rental housing being built and create other subsequent problems, if this were to materialize? And understand, like, it's really about, how do we find balance between both sides of this equation in order to really impact change? And, the three of us, sure, we can set out, maybe on the next episode, we'll solve this problem, right? But, for now, I think it's more of like understanding these variables, understanding that when you're reading these headlines, and if it's coming out of a politician's mouth, their intent is to take something very complex and just position it as like, just vote for Tim and all your problems are solved.
Right, and that's worth. And again, we're picking on Biden on this one, because this is something that again,
insert politician's name. Yeah,
right. It's purely a signal without any beef behind it. If you ask the other one, what he's going to do to make renting more affordable, besides cutting the government in half or whatever, some generic solution like that, there's not going to be much depth there. And that's one of the sad things about where we stand right now is we're not getting the depth, we're not getting the details, we're not getting analytical, we're not getting a lot of thoughts. I would love it if our politicians, every year they had like a PowerPoint presentation and say we're going to numerically show what we're doing to affect each number, and this is a plan, and we're going to let you in on what's the we just get a bunch of noise, and then eventually, occasionally things get passed, but that's about it. Uh, I also, just want to talk about, this is a signal, and we don't know if this is going to gain more traction. This is the first time I've ever heard of anything on a national level. We've seen this play out already locally in several cities throughout, but it's this first signal I've heard nationally. And this could be something that I wouldn't be surprised if got picked up, if there was movements behind this. I've already heard of a renters union before. I don't know if you guys heard of that, where there's a collection of renters getting together and they want to unionize being a renter. Uh, for the record, we may think housing is expensive here. We're a lot cheaper than Canada, a lot cheaper in a lot of places in Europe. I was in France the other day. No one there owns anything. Everyone there is a renter. We have a much higher owner occupancy rate than a lot of the country. A lot of that's due actually because of our financing and because we have more buildable land. So the way we solve it is to continue to make financing more affordable and to use the buildable land that we have. That would keep us way more affordable. Again, we're already more affordable than other countries, but that would make us even more affordable throughout.
I think it's actually interesting that this conversation comes up right at the time as, as Tim had mentioned, Powell just said, we finally acknowledged we have a housing shortage, so it's like we're providing money to provide more housing, but also we're going to try to we're going to signal that we're going to make some kind of caps to make it a little bit more difficult to be profitable, but also we still need more housing. Like those variables don't really just play out together. And I also think the timing of it is interesting as well, because I don't know about other places, but here in Florida, I mean, we're really starting to see the wave of a lot of the development that has been kind of in the works for the last, 2 or 3 years. And so anyone who paid attention to two of those economics classes, whether it was in high school or college, knows that with the supply, comes more competition, it puts the renter in a better position as far as having more affordable options because you have more competition, so it's the same thing that I just said. When you get kind of like that superficial outside force that's now coming in and trying to implement something, and it's like, just let the economy start to work, let the competition, let the private sector do what the private sector does, which is to compete for the renters they have to attract them. And you're not going to be able to attract them if you're outpriced, by this other inventory. So I just think it's bad timing in general to be having these conversations, and it doesn't even coincide with our economic forecast. So it's very interesting to hear. But the good thing about it is, we don't have to worry about that within our model. So it's just for the sake of conversation and making people aware, because like you said, it's just a bunch of headlines floating all over the place. It's like those articles or those posts you see on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, you click on them and there's actually no article. It was just a headline, or the article, references another article that references another article that was 3 sentences long. And all it did was just, restate the one sentence that was said. So I love the fact that we within Build to Rent actually read. I love that about us, so that we can actually, provide accurate information to the people that we're working with and speaking to, but also, like Tim said, just encourage people to actually do the research, before you start voting for, different things or implementing different policies. But I would go a step further than that also. And just, like I said, just do the boring math, make sure it actually pencils out. Make sure those things actually make sense, because a lot of times, unfortunately, they just don't make sense. But, maybe we could have like a US pro forma and just kind of, maybe Alvin and Tim could put the numbers together and we'll throw it out there and try to see if we can get anybody to bite on it. I don't know what to do at this point with it.
We'll
You
look to
know,
make it happen. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
Jasmine, you mentioned it earlier about investing, real estate investing, and emotion. And we've had quite a few conversations here today where we kind of are tiptoeing around politics. And, the reason kind of we take that approach is, politics are divisive, and probably, the most divisive time in politics is today. The second most divisive time in politics was yesterday, right? It is always divisive, and it's a bit compounding. But investors, the piece that we have to remember as investors is, and as I mentioned earlier, you have to the politics are the politics. You have to be able to build strategies where you're going to win, regardless of what policy is what Jerome Powell says, regardless of what our current president says. We're in an election cycle right now. There's a lot of these headlines that are going to pop up. But those successful investors understand that investing shouldn't be emotional from that perspective. You base it on the numbers. You base sound investment around those numbers and understand that, maybe I didn't agree with what this politician or that politician said. That's fine, but I'm still going to build my strategy around what they said. I'm still going to be prepared for if this does materialize, and taking that piece to say, folks, we're in an election cycle. Like things are going to get a lot more headliney for the next 6 months. But we still need to operate. You still need to build strategy. You still need to execute your strategy. And the more you can take the emotion of like, oh, I was so angry by what this person said. This is so dumb what this person said. This is going to end real estate investment, as we know it. Fine. Take it for what it is, though, and understand that they're grabbing attention. They're taking your attention, obviously, if you're reading the headline. But your job as an investor is to build your strategy, execute your strategy, and win long term.
With that said, I do want to thank you all for your time today. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care, guys. That'll have to be it. So I'm not doing that again.
Gold. Yep.
Well, I mean,
even gave you a transition.